Hello.
Hello,
Hi. Hello. Okay.
please Geshe.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. I will. Now, without reciting the prayers, but of course, important to go back to our
Hmm.
original motivation. So let's please take a moment to meditate on the right kind of meditation or the right kind of motivation. To focus on why we're here, why we're studying this text. Not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. So to think that may this become one of the causes for me to attain the fully enlightened state of a Buddha. So that be of greatest benefit to all sentient beings. Okay, so having set the motivation, now let's return to chapter 4, the last chapter. Well, the last chapter for this weekend. We've already read verse 76. Next is 77. And as we've heard, it's all about overcoming arrogance. And it says in 77, society's servant paid with the sixth part. Why are you so arrogant? Your becoming the agent of actions depends on being placed in control. Well, this is giving an explanation with regard to this, the situation of a king at the time. A king here is addressing basically those who are in charge. Now, to understand that in India, well, India used to not be one country, but it consisted of different, kingdoms, if you like, kind of small areas, and each area was ruled by a king, by someone of the royal caste. As you know, India still nowadays operates on the caste system. People belong to certain castes, and that was the case in ancient India at the time of Ayadeva. And so those of the royal caste would be in charge, and arrogance was often associated with those ruling certain parts. And the story goes that, well, how did these royal caste come into existence? How did these kings, these kingships, how did they develop? And the story goes, well, historically, that people started working on the fields, and because of theft, because of robbery, so they would lose their harvest to other people robbing them off their harvest, and they therefore appointed someone to protect what they had yielded on their fields and give that person in payment, or as payment, give that person a sixth of their harvest. And that person was additionally appointed to just guard the fields, and then this person was eventually called the king. This is how historically, well, how Ayadeva, how the commentaries describe it, that before they had kings in the way we knew them at that time, and even nowadays in some places, well, it started off with this kind of protection. Therefore, Ayadeva argues, well, a king is actually a servant of society, and is being placed in control by society. Now, if it wasn't for the people, a king wouldn't be a king, which is why arrogance is not appropriate. So becoming the agent of actions, becoming the one in charge of certain action, depends on being placed in control. Now, this can be, of course, applied to any situation. So, saying a little bit about arrogance, what is arrogance? Well, arrogance arises, of course, out of the misconception of reality, projecting a self to this mind and body, and not just leaving it at that, projecting that self, believing that self to be more precious, more important than others. So who believes that? It's the mind. In the case of my own mind, my mind conjures up that it's like it comes up, it has that notion of a separate self. It's that inborn misconception of reality, and it appears to my mind. There's a separate self that appears, and there's also the mind also holds on to it, and that is deeply ingrained in my psyche, in my mind, in my mental continuum. All the other minds, they're all influenced by that. And that mind believing, well, because this I, this self, is associated with the mind, it's close to the mind that makes it up, because it's not associated with the mind of another person, but with this mind. Therefore, it's considering it to be more important, more precious, and its happiness also more important, more precious, which then leads to all sorts of other minds basically reacting to that. Reacting by way of, for instance, arrogance. If my situation, there's something, I mean, my situation, my status, my wealth, the, I don't know, the outside of my body, whatever it is, I hold on to something I associate with mine, and I generate conceit about it. And as all these afflictive emotions, they do not function unless I ignore dependent arising. Now, it's such an interesting emotion because I feel very arrogant about, well, my knowledge, for instance. If I have a certain knowledge, a certain understanding of a particular subject, I may feel arrogant about it. However, I forget there are so many other factors involved, so many other people involved in the process of giving me an education. In the same way, being a king, having a certain status, well, there are other people involved. I mean, without other people, someone couldn't be a king. Without a land that is there, that is, well, the king is allowed to rule over. Um, he's given the power is accepted. A king couldn't be a king. Therefore, what's so special about it? That's really what this is saying. Therefore, society's servant. Kings are basically society's servants. Why are they so arrogant? Why are you so arrogant? You're in charge of things because of being placed in control. And then it goes on to say, when those in his care receive their due, they think of their master as the giver. When the master gives what is to be given, he thinks with conceit, I'm the giver. So in that kind of interaction between the king and his subject, well, the subject gives money to the king, a sixth of their harvest or whatever it is in different kingdoms. So when the king gives them, well, receives, when they receive their due, which means the protection that they are entitled to because they've paid taxes. They think as their master as the giver. They think of the king, wow, he gives us. They don't realize that they actually give to the king as well. And then the master thinks that he's the one that gives what is to be given. That is the protection. Again, what other people are entitled to. And he's full of self-importance and conceit. I'm the giver. Whereas actually it goes both ways. Those who are in the care of the king, they also give something to the king and they get something in return. Giving of taxes, giving of respect, whatever it is. Okay. And 79, that which you wrongly regard, others consider a source of suffering. Living by working for others, what causes you pleasure? So a king may wrongly think that being in the position of a king is a source of great happiness, which others who understand the drawbacks of being a king consider to be a cause of suffering. So really, there's not a single position in samsara that is just in and of itself wonderful. I mean, being a king has so many drawbacks. There's so many disadvantages, and it involves great responsibilities and great hardships when working to protect others. Um, and it also exposes the king to great dangers, samsaric dangers, in the process of craving for power, for wealth, for women, and so forth. Um, and also, what does the king have to do? Possibly have to punish criminals. And again, how can that be pleasurable? How can many of the responsibilities a king have? How can they be pleasurable? Again, to think about them, what makes up the life of a, and also in our own situation when we find ourselves again, no matter, I mean, here we have to transfer it to our own situation. I mean, as I said earlier on, we may think we're not arrogant, but I guarantee you we all have a certain degree of arrogance, and it's sometimes hard to recognize. But often, if it's, of course, usually with the dealing with other people, we believe we just know better. I mean, we may know better, of course, but it doesn't it doesn't just it doesn't just remain at that thought, oh, I just know it better, so I may just explain it to them. But it's more like we're full of conceit, kind of like self-importance, and believing we're better. It's just exaggerating a quality and then believing myself to be better because of that quality, totally ignoring negative qualities. So, whereas craving was more focusing on the positive quality of another person, leading to craving, the wish to possess that, arrogance is a kind of quality where we focus on a personal quality that we already have. So, there's no craving there. There's definitely attachment to it, but there's no craving as such because we already have it. And the sense I'm better than someone else. And that, of course, expresses itself in our dealing with others. Now, one example would be, I mean, I've observed this time and again when people, for instance, come to the third world, like they come to India with, of course, a certain knowledge, certain expertise, knowing how things are done in their own country, just different, aspects. And then they come to the monasteries, for instance, and they see how the monks and nuns do things. And there's oftentimes the sense, I know better, and trying to teach the nuns to do it differently. And oftentimes it's done with the best intention, not out of conceit or arrogance. And then very quickly they realize, well, it works in their own country, but it doesn't necessarily work in a country like India, where things are done differently. But sometimes if there's arrogance there and there's a sense of like, I know better, it takes much harder for them to understand, well, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. These ideas are great. In theory, they work great. They work in our own country, but they don't work in those systems. And they have their own systems that are adjusted to the environment, that fit the environment, the circumstances. So again and again, I notice that. And sometimes it comes with real arrogance. And it's well meant, of course. It's a mixture. There's the wish to help. But then also when they come across things being done differently, the sense, oh no, my way is the only way. And so it's up to us in our workplace, in our family life. Do I really know better? Am I just being rational here? Okay, I know in this place it's better. It's just easier for everyone involved. So I very gently present my ideas to others. And if they don't accept them, that's also fine. I've tried it, but it's also okay. Therefore, if we find we're not able to let go, it's like, no, but my idea is the right idea. Well, that's arrogance. It comes from arrogance again, the stubbornness, not being able to concede, not able to give in that moment. So therefore, there are many different aspects. And as I said, if we consider ourselves to be a humble person and other people do it too, we may have actually an obstacle to recognizing that we're humble. The obstacle for someone who's arrogant, they may feel very arrogant about their good qualities. And then again, being honest about their own honesty, about their own arrogance, their self importance may be difficult. So it's always a difficult emotion to admit. That is first to admit to ourselves and, of course, to admit to others. Anyway, here it's more to do with the king. But again, if we have certain qualities, well, it's also from others. These qualities, it's not something we just came up with on our own. It's dependent on many factors. And of course, these qualities are not us. So there's the labeled I, the merely imputed I, and then there are those qualities. They're definitely not identical. Okay, then it goes on to say, when a ruler, what causes your pleasure? Okay, anyway, so no, what else I meant to say that sometimes we're so wow, thinking, what a job, I want this. We're holding on to for certain reasons, but we don't see its drawbacks. We're not really aware of the drawbacks, and we believe we'd be happier if we hold on to this, while in actuality, we could be just as happy doing something else. In particular, people in power who cannot give up their power. And right now, of course, we can observe a certain person who's lost the election and is still holding on. I mean, it's sad to see the degree of desperation, not being able to let go and really harming himself such a big way. I mean, it's terrible to see, totally destroying any hope for a legacy. So on one hand, is it such a desirable job? I mean, the hardship, the responsibility, and so forth. But not being able to see the drawbacks, only focusing on the power, etc., and not being able to let go. So much suffering. The more arrogant a person is. Okay. So therefore, 7980, when a ruler seems to be the protector of his people, as well as protected. Why be proud because of the one? Why not free from pride because of the other? So it goes both ways. A king may feel arrogant because he protects his subjects. However, a king also receives protection from his subjects, since he wouldn't be unable to rule, as mentioned before, without the support of his people. So, in this case of a different type of ruler, a democratic ruler, again, a ruler may feel really proud. He protects the people, but they protect the ruler, as in like supporting the ruler and not revolting against the ruler. Therefore, receiving the support of his subjects should instead give rise to humility, should appreciate really that what comes from the people, like coming back from the people, being protected by the people. And oftentimes it doesn't lead to that. We just see one side, one aspect, and don't see the entire picture. You don't see the whole situation. It's also that vast perspective. Now, vast perspective implies, of course, interdependence, because if we have a vaster perspective, we realize how things are connected. In the sense that not only are you a ruler who protects others, or someone a ruler is in a certain position, it goes both ways, which therefore no longer justifies feeling proud, because on the other hand, we should feel humbled. We should feel humbled by the fact that others support us and protect us. And in that way, also, what is so important to, we live in a class system. Now, we don't live in a caste system, but we live in class systems. I believe that's true for Israel. This is true for any country. There are certain classes in society, and we may have a certain standing. This is another aspect where arrogance comes in. We believe ourselves to be a higher class. And we may look down on someone such as a garbage collector. But really, if we think about these lowly jobs, I mean, like sweeping the ground, cleaning the streets, I don't know, repairing cars. And I mean, without these people, what would we do? What would we do without the people who, stock up the supermarket? I mean, we would walk in, there's nothing to buy. Or we have to go into the storeroom and pick it out and search for it ourselves. So there's so many people who make our life easier. The cashiers at the supermarket, we may look at them as being, but without them, we wouldn't be able to pay for our food, etc. So also, when we feel a little superior to them, to appreciate the contribution they make. I mean, just garbage collectors. What would our cities look like if it wasn't for them? If no one wanted to do the job. So cleaning toilets, all that. And that way, to appreciate also these lowliest jobs that are actually not lowly, they're extremely important. They're just as important as running a country or running a company and so forth. Therefore, this wider perspective, understanding that a system only works as long as everyone involved does his or her part. And so I'm part of this system, and other people are too. And I feel proud about myself, kind of putting myself before everyone else. Okay. Now, therefore, in particular with in the case of a person having responsibilities, well, it's two-way thing. It's a two-way street, as in like it goes both ways. Then in 81 it says, those in each caste prefer their own work. Thus, a living is hard to find. If you become non-virtuous, good transmigrations will be scarce for you. Now, this is talking about the situation in India at the time when the caste system in the very beginning, the caste system definitely worked better. It was a very effective system. We'll get more into this in a later verse. But the point is, things were quite working quite nicely, and slowly time changed, and people believed their job was more important than everyone else's. So there was less support for one another, and life had become harder, even in India. Now there are kind of descriptions of times around the time of the Buddha. Things were smoother. People were more interested in virtue and were more virtuous. And so in time, it had degenerated to a certain degree. And now, at the time of Ayadeva, it was like people were no longer supporting each other. So they prefer their own work, their own caste. They only saw that. And living was just more difficult because there was less support. Now, if someone takes taxes in this case and benefits from the people who engage in non-virtues, and one has the wrong kind of motivation, one actually approves of their action to a certain degree, and therefore one accumulates non-virtue indirectly. Indirectly, as in like approving of what other people do, taking their money and they engage in non-virtues, well, we accumulate non-virtues. It's almost like giving them taking the money of a thief, or taking the stuff that a thief has actually stolen. So in that way, if we accept the stolen goods, well, we accumulate negativities indirectly. Likewise, those this time and age, being a king, being a ruler, well, if there's a lot of negativity in the country and we let it go and we don't do anything, make an effort, etc., and just take their money, well, we have a problem in the case of a ruler. Okay, so there's great negativity that could arise. Then it says in 82, how are we at time? 22 minutes? Okay. Those who act at others' insistence are called fools on this earth. There's no one else at all so dependent on others as you. So it may seem that a king is powerful and independent, but actually that is not so. Actually, like they're actually acting upon other people, insisting on other people, kind of giving them jobs to do, and in ordinary life that would be called a fool, like a person who believes they're totally powerful and independent, but they have to kind of act upon what is needed in the country. In the case of a king, well, that's a foolish person, but a king is totally dependent on the requests of his subjects and cannot just live a quiet life. So again, just talking about how certain positions that we think are so incredible, we want to be famous, we want to be have this position, that position, actually they hold a lot of disadvantages, such as you're totally at the mercy of other people. You have to go according to what people want. Even if you can't please them all the time, they may actually, well, go against you and may topple you and whatever kind of get rid of you and so forth. So it holds great danger, and there's very little freedom with this kind of job. So to consider the things we wish for, what are we wishing for? We need to be careful about what we wish for. And I also talked about previously, like people like to be famous. There is definitely a wish, and the internet kind of shows that, who's more. I mean, like all these TV shows where people kind of like are watched. What is it, Big Brother, and people are watched in their life, so they become famous because everyone watches them spending their life and fighting with other people, like Jungle Book or something. Anyways, this jungle thing there, where people are together and all this, and it's like there's such a such an emphasis on being famous, especially nowadays. One can become famous because of the social media that people, easily pay more attention. And so we wish for things, and it's so important, like to be careful with what we wish for, because that doesn't necessarily mean we are happier. In fact, it may take away all our freedom. We can no longer go on the street on our own. We cannot be anonymous and so forth. So always to think of the drawbacks of any situation. So this is being pointed out here, of course, plus also the drawbacks of having this kind of job. And then it says in 83, claiming protection depends on me. You take payment from the people, but if you perform ill deeds, who is equally merciless? Okay, so a king may um, engage in a lot of non virtuous actions, believing that the welfare of his subjects depends on him. He may demand a large payment and engage in negative actions such as killing others, killing those who threaten his subjects. So he's not actually helping his people, but he's taking money for his effort, believing, oh, people depend on me and it's there. They may actually fool themselves in thinking I'm working for the welfare of sentient beings, but actually, if they engage in a lot of non-virtuous actions, taking a lot of money and engaging in well killing and so forth, when it comes to someone threatens his subjects or his own power, well, he's actually not helping people. He's just taking their money, um, and for his effort in the sense that he believes he's doing something positive. Then in 84, now this is not really hard to understand. It's just arguing, giving us the means to really analyze every situation. It's showing us how to do it. And now we need to take the same analysis and apply it to our own situation. Or if we're really proud of what we have reached, believing ourselves to be more important, or if we strive towards a certain position, maybe being in charge at work, doing certain things we strive for. So if it's any kind of position, any standing in society, being respected and so forth, it all comes along with drawbacks. It has advantages that other jobs don't hold, but it also has disadvantages that other jobs don't hold. And it's pretty equal. And whether it's happy or not totally depends on our state of mind. Okay, but here he says that if people who do ill deeds should not be treated with mercy, all ordinary childish people would also not need to be protected. So someone may think that it's necessary for a king to punish some people to protect others. But actually, a king should act out of love and compassion. So punishing people, well, if the motivation is to benefit the people who've engaged in negativities, the people who are exposed to those negativities, that's a different matter. But it should come, it should be punished in the sense out of love and compassion to benefit others, but not just for the sake of punishment. If it was not inappropriate, it's not, it is inappropriate to act out of anger and so forth to punish others. If it was not inappropriate, it would also not be appropriate to protect all ordinary childish people with love and compassion. So, in other words, a king should develop equal love and compassion for his subjects, not just for the ordinary kind of childish in the sense of not being able to protect themselves. Here, the word childish kind of means simple minded, certain simple minded people that the king kind of feels protective of. Maybe subjects who, like his subjects who are not well educated and so forth, kind of feels protective of them. But what about those engaging in negative actions? A king should equally care for them and, of course, only punish them out of love and compassion and not for other reasons. So, again, if someone is in that position of power, they have special responsibility. Before we meditate, so 85. There's nothing that will not serve as a reason for happiness. Reasons such as scriptural statements will not destroy demerit. So here we need to explain those first two lines. We can come up with all sorts of wrong explanations that justify negative actions. Based on those wrong explanations, there's allegedly nothing that is not a cause of happiness. Okay, so there are a lot of explanation telling us if we do this, we do that, people justifying their actions and kind of publishing them, kind of talking about this will give you happiness. If you're just more selfish, you'll be happier. If you put your foot down and you show how strong you are, you'll be happier. All that is just, they're wrong explanations. Those are just, we need to analyze them. Because otherwise there's nothing that doesn't cause happiness. Oh, drink a lot of alcohol, it gives you happiness. Take a lot of drugs, it gives you happiness. I mean, my grandfather used to say, paper is patient. Nowadays you could say, well, the internet is patient. You can just post about anything, start your own website, just say anything you want, and you probably find some people who believe that if you're just eloquent enough in your writing, you convincing enough in your writing. So really it's important to not just take it on face value. We need to analyze what we read, because otherwise anything could be justified as being a cause of happiness. But these are wrong explanations. So these explanations don't protect us from negative consequences of our harmful actions. So reasons such as scriptural statements or statements online on some kind of blog, what have you, they will not destroy the non-virtuous actions. Therefore, we can't believe everything. And we oftentimes justify our actions, kind of, we want to do it, and we know it's actually not correct, but that would be too hard to do it knowing it's not correct, and therefore we convince ourselves with all sorts of weird ideas that what we do is correct. Okay, now this is just practical day-to-day advice. Um, Taking our own life. Well, of course, like I said initially, and we'll meditate on this, but before that, I just want to say a few words. So, this is not fancy philosophy that is hard to understand and we can have these beautiful debates and all that. No, it doesn't require that. It's just reality. It's practical. But it's that which we need to bring into our own life, to be totally honest, to be honest about ourselves, to recognize the negative emotions that try to suggest a reality, that project a reality that is impossible, and that cause us to be full of conceit when actually our qualities are dependent on so many other people, but that cause us to justify our behavior by just believing some weird idea that, well, if you're just selfish enough, you'll be happy. All that. Now, without believing it, we should analyze it and see whether this holds true or not. So to be a little bit more skeptical and not believe everything that's written on the news, that well is said in the newspapers. That's even scientists say we have to be careful. Of course, they have a lot of knowledge, but the scientists are the first to say, well, we don't know everything, and a lot of what we say are unproven theories, and oftentimes it takes a few years until the opposite uh, has has been found to be true. Okay. All right. Anyway, now let's spend some time meditating on this practical advice. And since none of you, I suppose, are kings or rulers, I try and adjust these ideas a little bit to make them more applicable to our own life. Okay. But as usual, we start first with some breathing meditation just to calm the mind. So now bring to mind a situation or a quality, anything that you recognize in yourself as giving rise to a feeling of arrogance, of a certain degree of self importance. sense of entitlement. And then reflect on the causes and conditions that gave rise to whatever it is that gives rise to that arrogance. Other people were involved in cultivating a certain quality or knowledge. You need people who put you in that situation, who agree with you to have that status, who give you that status. To think of all the causes and conditions that gave rise to whatever makes you feel proud and arrogant. So, in what way do I feel arrogant about something that, although I contributed to it, so many other people contributed to it? And if I find myself caught in a kind of class system, kind of thinking that I'm of a higher class, of a higher standing, versus those who perform lowly activities and lowly jobs, think how important these lowly jobs are. What would we do without garbage collectors, cashiers at the supermarket, people cleaning toilets in public buildings? Why would I believe my contribution is more worthwhile than their contribution? And also check the things you wish to attain. If you crave to have a certain position at work, if you wish yourself to be rich or famous, you wish yourself to be very popular, be the boss of a huge company. Well, recognize how your mind projects a type of happiness onto those goals. That cannot be found when you analyze those situations. Having more responsibilities, there's greater danger of harming others. Being more vulnerable to jealousy and criticism by others. Having to protect one's wealth. No longer being able to walk alone on the street without being mobbed. Having to take care of many people even when we don't feel like it. What is there to really feel arrogant about when it involves such hardships and does not bring lasting satisfaction and contentment? And of course, the higher our standing, the greater the danger of accumulating great negativity, harming us in the future. And of course, a lot less freedom. And instead of being arrogant and proud about having a certain standing or a certain achievement, we can only make it meaningful if we dedicate it for the welfare of others. If we treat others equally and develop love and compassion, even for the ones who make mistakes and who are difficult to be with. And let's be honest, do we justify negative actions because we believe all sorts of ideas that famous people have talked about or that were explained somewhere online? If we're really honest to ourselves, you may realize that those are negative actions that just justify our craving. And now to complete this short analysis, apply single-pointed meditation and just focus on whatever insights you've gained. To allow for it to sink deeper into your consciousness and thereby be able to influence you in your daily life. Okay, so slowly rise from the meditation. Okay. All right, so last 15 verses, not that much to go. Let me just check with you what time is the next break? In about 40 minutes, am I right?
The next break is at, yes, that's correct.
In 40 minutes, great. Okay, just to make sure we've got enough time. Great. Now Well, let's just continue with words. That is, unless there's a question. Now, maybe it's a good time to ask. Are there any questions? I don't see anything in the chat. No, it doesn't seem there's any question. Okay, great. There'll probably be time at the end. We could do some question answer then. Okay, so 86. The text reads, if giving proper protection is a ruler's religious practice, why would the toil of artisans too not be religious practice? Okay, now this is going into what is religious practice. Is it religious? Is someone may believe that protecting his people, for a king to protect his people, is virtuous and therefore religious, but actually the king gets paid for it. So the point is you get paid for it. And if, of course, the motivation of the king is to benefit his people, his subjects, and so forth, that's a different matter. It all depends on the motivation. But receiving payment for it, well, any work you get paid for that benefits others should automatically be virtuous and therefore religious. But of course, we know that's not true. I mean, a cashier in the supermarket, an office worker, we get paid for it. And of course, we don't live in a bubble, and it affects people in general. It contributes to the well-being of society, but it depends on society, on our own intention. Of course, we can make it religious. That's what I'm saying. If what we learn here, so if you're part of Sunday's classes, I try to stress it on during those classes, and here as well, the same applies. Those ideas, yes, they come from the 3rd century, and they talk about kings, and they use words we maybe not use on a daily basis, the 6th of the payment, but those are just words. And the point is the same ideas still apply nowadays. The same afflictions, the same workings of these projections, they still apply. And reading it and feeling, oh, this is nice, that's just not enough. It may make sense in the spur of the moment, but what we need to do is bring it into our own life to really make a difference, to really make changes. And those changes are only positive. You go from being, well, more depressed, more anxious, and so forth, to a person who's more confident, who is not as close minded, who sees the things in a wider perspective and just turns calmer and more satisfied. And that's what all this is about. And if there's liberation and enlightenment, well, wonderful. But even if there isn't, well, at least our lives are just a little bit happier. And there's a teaching by Geshe Kelsang. Unfortunately, I haven't really been able to work on it recently because I was busy with other things, but usually I translate a class or two, or at least a few bits of a class. And he gives this teaching on the Four Noble Truth and how we can think of the Four Noble Truth just from the point of view of this life. He says usually in the scriptures they stress more past and future lives, but we can take them just to make this life more worthwhile. And since we don't know about past and future lives, well, let's pretend there are future lives and prepare accordingly. It's just a win-win situation, but also be aware that we can make our life much calmer, much happier, much more fulfilled by putting this into practice. But he stresses this. It's not enough to go to a Dharma teaching. It's not enough to go have a problem and think, oh, I'll just go to a teaching, makes me feel better. Well, it may for a few minutes because it makes sense and it sounds nice, possibly, or maybe not. But the point is to apply this. This is only beneficial if you bring this into your own life, and not to ignore this sentence or that sentence, but try and see how could that be relevant to my own life, because our lives are complicated, full of so many afflictions and so many misconceptions. And we need to first recognize them and work with them and slowly and gently reduce them. And this text definitely gives us that opportunity. I'm so enthused by this text. I believe this is so beautiful. In preparation for this, I had to read these verses extensively and really think about them, and they blow my mind. Incredible. I never realized how amazing they were when I just listened to the teachings. So hopefully this comes across to you as well, meditating on them. internalizing them to a certain degree. All right. Anyway, so verse, what is it, 86? I just read that. Now, believing that this is religious practice. Now, otherwise, everything becomes religious practice if you get paid for it. So, no job in any way becomes religious unless the motivation is right. Then, even cleaning toilet can be a bodhisattva action. Okay. Then, 87. This example shows the ruler on whom the people rely as reprehensible. The excellent see attachment to existence as mother of all those in the world. So protecting others out of attachment to one's job and so forth, is just not appropriate. It's reprehensible. If the king is full of arrogance and engages in reckless actions motivated by attachment, this protection is inferior and therefore reprehensible. Why? Because attachment is the mother that is one of the main causes of samsara and needs to be abandoned. It just cannot. It cannot operate. When it operates, it cannot give us lasting happiness. It just harms us. And we need to recognize that. Recognize that it's these internal states of mind, they really harm us. The external is what it is. It affects us or it doesn't affect us based on our own mind. Okay. So that's 87. And then 88. The sensible do not acquire kingship, since fools have no compassion. These merciless rulers of men, although protectors, are irreligious. Okay, in general, sincere practitioners are not attached to power and wealth, and they're not eager to become kings. So, I mean, if they have to be, okay, for the welfare of others, yes, but they're not attached to this power and wealth, and they're definitely not eager on taking on that responsibility just for the sake of it. Those who are ignorant about actions and their results, so fools here, those who just don't know about actions and their results, or don't choose not to believe that actions have consequences, well, they lack compassion. And those merciless rulers who lack compassion, those merciless rulers who well, are motivated by selfishness and so forth, they're not engaging in the practice of transforming their mind, even though they may provide some protection for their subject. So in no way this can be religious. Okay, so it cannot be religious unless you do it for the welfare of others. And religious, of course, in the Buddhist sense, of course, this may be debated by someone of not following this path and believing religious practice to be something different. But of course, I only talk from the Buddhist perspective here. So, excuse me. So therefore, those who don't believe in karma, do not believe their actions have consequences and thereby engage in negative actions. So those who are merciless, who have no compassion, well, no way. If they're rulers of men, there's no religion involved. Then 89. Sages' activities are not at all actions that the wise perform, for they are inferior, mediocre, and superior ones. Now, okay, this needs to be explained. Not all the activities performed by so-called sages that are explained in certain texts are necessarily positive actions, because they're inferior, mediocre, and superior sages. All right, now this is an interesting statement, which may be also helpful when it comes to the behavior of the inferior actions of certain spiritual teachers. I mean, we may observe that. So sometimes lamas act in a way that is not appropriate. And so we also need to be able to distinguish. We need to understand who are so-called sages, like so-called, religious people. They not always are, although they may appear that way. That's important. But even those who actually are, well, there are different levels. There's inferior, like being beginners themselves and having certain qualities, of course, that inspire others, but that doesn't mean they're free from negative actions. Then there are the mediocre ones and the superior ones. So, really, to me, what this means is that even that they're considered to be religious people, sages, well, religious people considered to be religious, doesn't mean they always act in the right way. And we need to be careful. That also leads us to, of course, guru devotion, to be really careful when we initially look for a teacher. What are the qualities of this teacher? To really analyze for a long time, and not because my friends have a spiritual teacher and I feel like I'm not advancing enough, I need to have a spiritual guru. This is kind of spiritual, what is it called? Consumerism. No, that's not the right word. But anyway, this is something to that effect. Like, I need this, I need that for spiritual practice. I must have Durja and Bell. I must have this book. I must have the right incense. I must have a spiritual guru and so forth. So it's like trying to acquire all these things from the outside. And again, forgetting mainly, most important, of course, is to do the practice. And oftentimes, when the time is right, well, a spiritual teacher will appear. And in the meantime, you follow those who you've analyzed for long enough and don't just rely on the person right away. Just because this person has got some time, has got a fancy name. Certain spiritual teachers, well, we never get to see. So I don't want to be a student of certain lamas who I never get to see just because they won't pay attention to me. But that's not the right attitude, of course. They don't need to pay attention to us. We don't need to physically be close. Being able to see them every now and then, as in like a setting of teachings, and even if they don't know who we are, we connect to them mentally. We connect to them mentally, as in like we follow their advice, we think of them, we generate positive states of mind that are very helpful for ourselves, such as devotion and faith. Those are very beautiful qualities. Now, they're part of the religious aspect of Buddhism. And Buddhism is homeless. The Dalai Lama often talks of Buddhism can be divided into the religious aspect, the philosophical aspect, and the scientific aspect. Religious aspect, obvious. Well, that involves faith, devotion, those states of mind. They are particularly associated with the religious aspect. And then there's the scientific aspect when it comes to observing certain things within meditation, observing the mind, mindfulness, and so forth. So instead of using microscopes and so forth, you use the tool of meditation. Again, gaining insight into reality. And philosophical, well, there are different philosophical schools that we study in preparation for studying the final school. In that sense, you also have philosophy. You can take all three. It's not like in one teaching as homeless, it was to the TCV school. He gave a teaching in June, I believe it was this year, a virtual teaching or an online teaching. And at that time, his holiness specified when he was asked about those three, it's not like that there is that aspect necessarily that is just scientific, and then there's that aspect that's only philosophical. You can take any aspect in Buddhism and make all three. To take any practice you do, take it as a religious practice, bring in the scientific aspect and the philosophical aspect. You can do all three, and that makes your practice more complete. And the aspects of devotion, understanding that relying on your teacher, this devotion is just good for the mind. It calms the mind. It gives the mind a type of protection, an inner satisfaction, an inner contentment, and joy. Joy is so important. Actually, in Buddhism, they talk about a type of faith that is described as joyful faith. That is the kind of faith here. It's joy in when thinking about this Lama and his or her qualities, even though this person doesn't know who we are. In actuality, they do. I'm convinced if this is a qualified teacher, they know exactly who we are, what we are thinking. But that's not the point of it. They don't need to know us. They don't need to stroke us and tell us how special we are, which we'd like to hear, of course, but that's just giving into the self-grasping mind. Instead, we need to connect to what they say, kind of devote ourselves to them mentally, communicate with them. We can actually mentally communicate with them, kind of ask them for their help requesting them to be there for us. And before long, it actually works. This works if we do this. You just need to try it. If you have your own doubts, you have your own problems, if you devote yourself to one of those special beings, in particular, if you perceive this person to be one with all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, you actually receive help in that way. There's nothing I can say about it. It sounds spooky and magical. It's definitely scientific. There's scientific aspects to it. Once we have the tools, we can scientifically take it apart. Right now, we may not be able to do that. It may sound like magic, but that's just how the mind works. And that's how a highly realized being can also communicate with us and be there with us. So we don't need to be around a spiritual teacher and call them up all the time and have audiences all the time. Therefore, we can rely on someone who's as busy as His Holiness, but has the capacity to help endless living beings. And so, therefore, it doesn't matter if we can't see someone like His Holiness. So, that's one aspect about guru devotion. And of course, then look for a teacher who maybe who's qualified. That's more important than being available to us to talk to and so forth. Number one. But even though we rely on a teacher who may act in a way that we find inappropriate, to differentiate between the inappropriate behavior, condemn that, that is not okay, that's not acceptable, but also focus on what we've learned from that person. We do that with our best friends. We appreciate the best friend who we love, and we also know their negative qualities, and we love this friend, and we're able, in this case, it's love that governs that help us to accept those faults as well. So when we choose a teacher, there are different stages. Now, between being a bodhisattva and being a Buddha, there's so much in between. And we have this weird idea that, oh, my guru must be a Buddha. And then if my guru doesn't act like a Buddha, well, I don't know whether it's out of skillful means so we can relate to the teacher, or is it because the teacher has faults? Well, whatever it is, I focus on what well, either I don't accept this person as a teacher in the first place, okay. But if I find I've learned from this person, I've benefited from that person, I condemn those parts. I'm critical of the parts that don't agree with the Dharma and still benefit from them. Okay. So kind of take refuge, of course, in the pure Buddha, in the pure beings, in my own Buddha nature. Very important. But at the same time, still receive guidance from where guidance can be taken, whether this person is inferior, mediocre, or a highly realized being. And come on, Shantideva tells us even an obnoxious person should be your teacher. So we can deal with an obnoxious person and make them a teacher of patience, but we have a problem with, someone misbehaving. Yeah, it's not appropriate. It should be condemned. It should be put out in the open. Don't hide it. Put it out there. Very important. But what we've learned, we've learned. Either we don't rely on that person, or if we have, well, focus on those bits. And then you're not crushed. You're not crushed in thinking this is not working. These teachers act inappropriately. Well, yeah, some of them do because there are different levels towards full enlightenment. And before we eliminate all afflictive emotions, it takes some time. It's the 8th level of a bodhisattva. Now, if you know about the grounds and path of a bodhisattva, 8th level is really high up there. There's only 2 more levels until Buddhahood. So no surprise if you have afflictive emotions until then, and if habits and imprints that we all have, well, express themselves in certain ways, we shouldn't be surprised. And what did the Buddha say? The actual refuge is the Dharma. The refuge, such as the teacher and the Sangha, they're secondary. It's the Dharma. And the Dharma is right there in its purest form in front of us in the form of this text. And the teachers and so forth, they're the transmitter of the Dharma. And in that way, what they teach us is most important. The rest of it, well, we can leave it to the side, ignore it, because we are interested in the Dharma. Therefore, here there's so-called sages. I say so-called sages. I mean, maybe actual sages, because they have certain qualities, but in different lives, in different lifetimes, certain habits come through and they may act in a way that is inferior, and we should recognize it for that, but take the Dharma we learn. All right. Anyway, that I meant to say. So this is verse 89 and now 90. Okay. Virtuous ruler of the past protected the people like their children. Through the practice of this time of strife, this time of conflict, it is now like a waste without wildlife. So there were times of wise and compassionate rulers, of course, but during times of conflict, and these are difficult times we're in. So times of conflict and rulers of this world, they devastate the world, turning it into a waste without wildlife. Wow, this is the third century. What are they talking about? This sounds like 21st century, a waste. I mean, our world is being turned into a desert. We're losing all our wildlife. Well, I guess it started at that time. It's just part of life. And those times are difficult. And there were times when there were wise and compassionate rulers. But on a personal level, the more difficult the circumstances are, if we practice the Dharma, we progress much faster. Just is what it is. So, um, tough times are rough. And as Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo once said, well, if you want to smoothen a piece of wood, if you use some cotton, you'll take a long time to smoothen this piece of wood. If you take sandpaper, very quickly you can smoothen it. So our mind needs to be smoothened. It needs to be made more flexible. We need to reduce these afflictive emotions that actually harm us. So that's like making our mind smoother. And if the external is like cotton wool, everything is smooth and things work well and there are all these compassionate teachers, well, maybe things are too smooth and easy. We need hardships. Hardships are like sandpaper, okay? And therefore it is said that this time and age is difficult. These are degenerate times, but still they can be extremely beneficial. All right, now 91. If a king who seizes the occasion If a king who seizes the occasion to harm is not doing wrong, then others too, such as thieves, have not done so in the first place. So someone may believe that it's not non-virtuous if a king harms his enemy when the occasion arises. We may actually still believe this is justified to harm an enemy because he's a king. But if the king seizes the opportunity to take revenge on an enemy, and that action is not considered to be negative, well, then the action of a thief who takes revenge on someone by stealing something, well, that should also not be considered negative. So there's no justification. Even if you're in a king and you're supposed to crush your enemy and all that, well, it's still negative. Okay, last verse before we start meditating. If giving all one has for liquor and so on, it is not an offering. Why consider it an offering to give oneself in battle? So someone may argue that there's glory in battle, since in the case of survival, we'll get great wealth, we're rewarded with medals and so forth, while death for the king results in a higher rebirth. Some people may actually believe that that battle is something positive. But Ayadeva disagrees. He says, well, if spending money on liquor, gambling, and women is not a virtuous offering and not an offering to a great being, how could giving up one's life out of anger and greed be an offering? So if this war is fought out of anger and greed, and we participate in that, with the motivation, again, motivated by greed and anger and so forth, well, that cannot be a religious practice. It's only dependent on our motivation. So, in the same way, just giving something for the sake of giving our life, for the sake of something that is not just, well, depending, of course, also on our motivation, that cannot be virtuous. In the same way as spending money on liquor, gambling, and so forth, well, we're generous, we give money. That's not generosity. We pay for it. Okay, so it's not an offering to a great being. Now we need to be careful, therefore, what we call spiritual practice. Okay, and especially nowadays, then there's so many different ideas what spirituality means. We're easily fooled into engaging in activities that are not spiritual and still believe ourselves to be very spiritual. So this is just a reminder of that. Okay, now we got 8 verses left before we're done with the verses I meant to cover as part of this. And Remind me, how far did we meditate? It was 80, it was 90, was it? No. To what verse? Which verse did we start right after the break? I forgot.
86.
Until 86? Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, great. Good. All right. Now try to, in the meditation, of course, it's not literally what it says here, just kind of adjust it to the situation, to our personal life. And let's start again with some breathing meditation. Now, in particular, when it comes to spiritual practice, it's important to understand that only our motivation determines whether our practice is a Dharma practice or not. Receiving payment for activities, even though they connect to the Dharma, without the right kind of motivation, cannot be called spiritual or dharmic practice. And also any positive action that arises out of attachment is not virtuous. So even in our own situation, if we are in a place to protect others, let's try to replace our attachment for them for unconditional love and compassion. Since attachment is the mother of cyclic existence. So even though the attachment still remains, but to also work on generating unconditional love towards those under our care. And let's not forget, sincere practitioners are not attached to certain power and wealth. They're not eager to have status and a certain standing in society. And in case we are in a position like that, we should utilize it to transform our mind. To learn from the difficult times. Utilize any hardship with the practice of patience and love. And in our endeavor to transform the mind, to develop inner peace and contentment, we rely on spiritual teachers. But let's remember, relying on them means to practice what they teach. That doesn't mean that they even have to know us, that they have met us in person, or that we spend a lot of time with them. And also, if we come across spiritual teachers who are not necessarily superior, but mediocre or inferior, we can still learn the Dharma from them. Since we can also learn the Dharma from those who are obnoxious and difficult people. Learn the Dharma of patience. We should also understand that there were times when things were much smoother, when rulers were compassionate and religious. Whereas nowadays, the world has changed. With our world slowly turning into a wasteland. Without many trees and much wildlife left. But that should motivate us even more to practice the Dharma. Since at times of difficulties, our progress will be much smoother and faster if we really make an effort. And let's not forget that spiritual practice involves love and compassion that is equally directed at all sentient beings. It cannot be any type of violence. The destruction of an enemy. And there are no holy wars. Instead, there's the inner war with our own afflictive emotions. Since the real enemy is our misconception. So the only thing to fear, our own attachment, our aversion, and most importantly, our misconceptions. Which then again, we don't need to fear, because that is the only thing we can actually control, reduce, and overcome. And so now, to conclude this meditation as before, spend some time focusing on your insight that you've gained from meditating. All right, so now it's 3:30 where you are. Let's take a break, half an hour break.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So see you again in half an hour. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.